Tonight it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Carranza to St. John's College. Dr. Carranza received his doctorate in Germanic Studies at the University of Chicago and is currently an assistant professor at Harvard University's Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. He taught English as a Fulbright scholar at the Geschwisterschule in Konstanz, Germany. He has translated scholarly articles on subjects ranging from design rhetoric to dramatic ambiguity in Bertolt Brecht. His own publications center around the form and rhetoric of the poetry from authors including Rilke, James Fenimore Cooper, and Goethe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carranza to St. John's.
Thank you, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you for the generous invitation to present this lecture. It's my understanding that the entire freshman class has recently, very recently, read Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, both the essay and the poem. So, with that in mind, rather than begin with a broad philosophical or intellectual historical contextualization of Goethe's natural scientific endeavor, allow me to open instead with a close reading of the poem, one of Goethe's best known, if least translatable. Various moments in this poem will grant me the occasion to comment on other aspects of Goethe's morphology, what he termed the study of living forms and their transformations. At the same time, the poem will come to function as a kind of prism through which Goethe's own natural scientific thought can be refracted. I will argue that an anthropological interest subtends Goethe's plant morphology, one that only comes to explicit fruition in the poem. It's the first of many plant puns. One might very well object that at its concluding turn to human love in cosmic purview, the poem all too neatly conflates the vegetal and the human. To put the objection more pointedly, does not Goethe fall into the pathetic fallacy at his poem's end, projecting human terms such as love and desire onto plants? Is Goethe, in other words, guilty not just of anthropomorphism, but of a kind of anthropocentrism, symbolically exposed for us in the poem? Or, rather, is his invoking of an erotic or amorous, as well as religious semantics, part of a grander vision of the human being's place in a natural order? I'd like to suggest in this talk that Goethe's interest in the poem is not anthropocentric, but anthropoeccentric, an attempt to understand and productively dislocate the human being from the perspective of the plant, in an elucidation of mutual multi-species entanglement. I will begin by citing the translation by Frederick Turner and Susanna Ossath, not only because they preserve the original's metrical form, the elegiac distich of Catullus and Ovid, but also because it is more accurate than the translation by Douglas Miller, which also has its merits. For convenience, however, the slides display both translations as well as the original German. Both translations are there, the Miller in the middle and the German for those who have it at bottom. You are perplexed, my love, by this thousand-fold mixed profusion, flowering tumultuously everywhere over the garden grounds. So many names you are hearing, but one suppresses another, echoing barbarously the sound makes in the ear. The poem begins with an address to my love, this dialogic situation which frames the act of speech that the poem is, at the same time doubles as a pedagogical one. Our speaker and addressee are not only lover and beloved, but take on the roles of teacher and pupil, and in this sense, something about erotic desire and the desire to know, curiositas, are aligned in a manner that recalls Plato's Symposium, albeit transposed into the privatized dyad of bourgeois love. The framing dialogic situation is an erotically charged pedagogical encounter that triangulates the speaking lover and the addressed beloved with plant life, and something about coming to know the truth of plant metamorphosis will thus shed light on questions beyond the scope of botany, questions about the anthropology of human desire, sexual difference, and Goethe's broader epistemology of nature. For now, however, it suffices to dwell with the beloved's confusion. Indeed, their confusion is also our own as readers. We are immediately interpolated as my love, placed into the role of the beloved addressee. Of note here is that this is not, strictly speaking, on the whole, a didactic poem. The core of the text presents no absolutely clear-cut formulation of the 6 stages of plant growth, such that a reader unfamiliar with the essay could reconstruct clearly the 6 stages of its development, first from seed expanding to stem leaf, second from stem leaf contracting to calyx, third from calyx expanding to flower, from the subsequent contraction leading to the plant's reproductive organs, to the expansion into the fruit, and finally, in the 6th step, the contraction into a seed. The scientific essay, with its clearly numbered sections and subsections, endeavors to sequester the stages of plant metamorphosis so as to render the empirically invisible transitions between them intelligible to the mind's eye through the algebraic formulae, as Goethe put it, or conceptual operations of expansion and contraction of one and the same inner organ, what Goethe termed the transcendental leaf. The poem, on the other hand, allows these stages to subtly blur into one another, to model the entangledness of vegetal growth in poetic language. In other words, this is not merely a didactic poem in the sense of a poetic versification of Goethe's botanical doctrine, but rather a poem about the didactic situation itself. What is that didactic situation? The thousandfold mixed profusion consists not only of flowers, but of names, specifically names that echo barbarously in the beloved's ear. These are the Latinate species designations of Linnaean taxonomy. In Goethe's History of My Botanic Studies, which he wrote in 1828 to 30 and appended to his essay on plant metamorphosis when it was republished in his morphological notebooks, Goethe recounts that he had devoted himself to Linnaeus and his teaching as a young man with complete confidence. Nevertheless, a Linnaean approach to botany struck his poetic mind as lacking. The passage is worth quoting in full, for it sheds light on the fraught nexus between poetic and scientific language. If I am to become clear about these circumstances with consciousness, then think of me as a born poet who strives to form his words, his expressions, immediately on the objects of hand, in order to do them more or less justice. Such a poet now ought to assimilate a ready-made terminology in his memory, to have a certain number of words and epithets ready, so that when he encounters any form, Gestalt, he can make a skillful selection, apply it in a characteristic designation, and thus know how to order it. Such treatment always appeared to me as a kind of mosaic, where one places one finished piece next to the other in order to finally produce the semblance of a picture from 1,000 individual details. And so the demand, the Linnaean demand, the demand of taxonomy, in this sense, was to a certain extent repugnant to me. As Goethe goes on to explain, the task to designate genera with certainty, to subordinate the species to them, seemed to me insoluble. Linnaeus's prescribed correlation of empirical plant characteristics to taxonomic categories threatened to dissolve any genus once a deviant formation was discovered, generating 2 new genera. Rather than laying or overlaying a kind of discursive net of names, a verbal mosaic, onto the natural world that would afford some generality and thus epistemic orientation, a static taxonomic approach could only generate a 1,000-fold mixed profusion of barbaric names, one suppressing the other. Generalization of plant types founded on mere empirical correspondence to taxonomic categories is not the kind of generality that thinks, not true conceptualization in Goethe's view. Rather than a petrified verbal mosaic, a deadening mirror held up to nature, Goethe sought to form his words, his expressions, immediately on the objects at hand, to shape his language with the same protean plasticity evinced by vegetal forms themselves. The speaker of our poem thus continues, "Each of their shapes is alike, yet none resembles the other. Thus the whole of the choir points to a secret law, points to a holy riddle. I wish, lovely friend, that I were able to happily hand you at once the disentangling word." The first 2 lines of this passage have gone on to become a kind of poetic signature for Goethe's morphological thought tout court. Thinkers and artists as different as Ludwig Wittgenstein and Anton Webern cite them at key moments in their own intellectual projects. Key for our purposes, however, is the first line's formulation of the botanist's problem. All plants are alike and yet unlike one another. How to mediate, conceptually, verbally, similarity and difference, the unity and diversity of the vegetal realm. Whatever the secret law of plant metamorphosis may turn out to be, even the essay remains cautious in this regard. The poem mobilizes 2 metaphors to make sense of it, the choir and the holy riddle. The choir already points us to one avenue of solution, namely the aestheticization of nature, its apprehension in terms of the fluid polyvocality of music rather than the rigidity of taxonomic mosaic. As for the riddle, in his idiosyncratic yet powerful study from 1930, Simple Forms, André Jolles defined the riddle in helpful contradistinction to the myth. Quote, "Myth is an answer in which the question is implicit. Riddle is a question that demands an answer." What is the purpose of a riddle? The riddler already possesses the answer, while the guesser does not. As Jolles puts it, the riddler represents a knowledge, a wisdom, or a group bound together by knowledge. The guesser, for his part, is not someone who answers another's question merely, but someone who wishes to be admitted to his wisdom, to be accepted into the group, and who proves with his answer that he is worthy of this. The solution is thus a password, a shibboleth, that affords entry to something closed or concealed. The riddle, in other words, is an act of verbal initiation into a group. Think of the riddles that appear as tests for entry into a secret society or as affording passage to an otherwise forbidden realm. That Goethe speaks of a holy riddle and the disentangling word that would be its solution elevates the knowledge of plant metamorphosis beyond the pedestrian situation of a botanist explaining his field to a love interest. We are, rather, in a religious sphere here, and the kind of knowledge at issue is not simply scientific, a matter of newly assimilated concepts or terminology, but rather a kind of epistemic conversion, an act of knowing as one of initiation into a higher truth about the beloved's own existence, who they are and what their love truly means, the larger currents of nature within which it partakes. This very issue of participation and its role in Goethe's epistemology comes to the fore in the poem's very next lines. Oh, there you have the choir and the riddle. Watch now and be transformed, how bit by bit the plant form, guided stepwise, builds to emerge in blossom and fruit. The first line is difficult to translate. Werdend betrachte sie nun is most literally, becomingly contemplate them now, contemplate the vegetal transformations now in such a way that you yourself will undergo transformation. Goethe turns the verb to become into an adverb of the imperative contemplate, a grammatical possibility normalized by the German language. This aligns perfectly with Goethe's claim in a text setting forth the purpose of his morphology that when something has acquired a form, it metamorphoses immediately to a new one. If we wish to arrive at some living perception of nature, Goethe says, we ourselves must remain as quick and flexible as nature and follow the example she gives. In other words, this poem on the metamorphosis of plants is just as much about the metamorphosis of the beloved, her initiation through the holy riddle into a new kind of love, their transformation elicited by a kind of epistemic conversion, and by extension, given our placement as readers in the position of that beloved, our own literary conversion to a certain stance toward our participatory embeddedness in nature. These are the first 10 lines of the poem, and we won't have time to go through the text's entirety in such detail, but suffice it to say that these 10 lines form a coherent unit, as it were, in the poem's broader argument. It's helpful with any poem to segment it into distinct parts. One can then work with smaller units, summarizing their theme or problematic, then zooming out to see how they fit together into a whole, perhaps correspond or stand in tension with one another. I've subjected the poem to such a segmentation, and these first 10 lines form one such unit. Call it the dialogic situation of pedagogical eros, articulating the botanical problem of unity in diversity. One can make out 6 such sections in the poem, and of course, other segmentations are possible and open up other potentially valid interpretations. The second, consisting of lines 11 to 22, address the germ's latency, its ensconcement within the dark, almost womb-like earth, and its exposure to the holy, eternal light above that draws it upward to more elaborate articulation. Already here, the seed is an initial prototype, ein beginnendes Vorbild, and metamorphically troped as an infant, ein Kind. The third section consists of lines 23 to 32 and introduces the closest thing to an agent in the poem, the drive on the part of the plants, the drive or trieb, translated first as a following impulse, and then, at the segment's conclusion, in a state of fuller leafy expansion out of the germ's contraction. Now in full force appears the drive to be endlessly free. With the inner prototype from segment 2 and the propulsive drive of segment 3, the stage is now set for the fourth segment. This longest section, lines 33 to 52, witnesses the plant's oscillating expansion and contraction into full-fledged stem, letting the vein of the stem build itself fully out. Then calyx, crowding around the axil, the mounting cup comes to decision, and finally the flower. The penultimate segment, lines 53 to 62, introduces a mythic register, again anthropomorphizing the pair of plant organs as the lovely couples together, round the sacred altar in order arranging themselves, as Hymen, the Greek god of marriage, consecrates their vegetal union. A sententious rhetoric then enters, allowing nature to fasten this ring of vegetal reproduction onto the eternal chain of procreative forces, that the whole be revitalized, as is the single individual. The poem could very well have ended here, One helpful question to ask oneself when analyzing a literary work is, if this one detail were negated, its very opposite, or otherwise done, how would that affect the whole of the work? The question gets at the idea that the aesthetic artifact evinces an inner necessity, even if a fragment. It would be a different kind of necessity. Each segment contributes to an internal poetic coherence. Were the poem to end here, we would have ended with a kind of didactic truth. We'd have a straightforward didactic poem on our hands, for we would have lost the dialogic frame. Instead, the poem returns to that frame, completes it by addressing the beloved and by extension the reader once more. Turn now, beloved, your eyes to these blooming and colorful multitudes. See how, perplexing no longer, they stir there in view of your soul. Every plant announces to you now the laws eternal. Every flower louder and louder is speaking with you. You but decipher here the holy letters of the goddess, everywhere though you see her, in even their changing itself. In the original German, these vegetal forms do not merely stir in the beloved's soul, but vor dem Geiste, before the beloved's mind. The metaphor of the chorus returns, each plant speaking its laws eternal, no longer a secret law. Our riddle has been solved. Of course, the beloved never once speaks in the course of this poem, which intensifies the implicit identification with the reader. If one's reading silently, that is. If you read the poem aloud, you're interpolated as the lover rather than the beloved, a curious duplicity. Rather, the riddle has been solved in the performance of the poem's very language. Immediately following the musical metaphor of choral orality, we are confronted with nature's newfound legibility. You but decipher here the holy letters of the goddess. Even in the very changing itself of the vegetal forms, the invisible transitions between empirically perceivable growth stages that have become conceptually perspicuous to the beloved's gaze, implicitly to our own reading gaze. One would have to subject the poem to the true scrutiny of a close reading of the original German, especially in the longest and most syntactically complex fourth segment, in order to bear this claim out. But for our purposes, what matters is that Goethe is entrusting to poetic language an ability to, as he put it earlier, form words and expressions immediately on the objects at hand. In other words, the poem imagines its own hermeneutic legibility as participating in the legibility of nature, and it does so through a performative initiation of the reader into a sacred realm of knowledge, an elicitation of a kind of literary epistemic conversion that makes not this or that botanical maxim legible, but rather the legibility of the vegetal realm itself visible, as if for the first time. At issue here, in other words, is thus not simply rendering plant metamorphosis scientifically intelligible, but rather the poetic performance of an intuition, of the very possibility of such intelligibility in its original incipience. Such an intuition is, one must admit, not quite a scientific one, but more akin to revelation. At this point, the poem swiftly scales up from the plant to animal and human life, encompassing all within its metamorphic law. Slow crawls the caterpillar, in haste the butterfly flutters, man, the adaptable, changes himself, the foreordained form. Now, the very relation of lover to beloved is folded within the processes unfolding within nature. The germ of acquaintance develops little by little in us a familiar dearness, unveiling friendship from our inner concealment, eventually the same movement of thought and an erotic union consecrated in commitment. Love in its holiness, die heilige Liebe, captures the holy from the holy riddle at the beginning of the frame. unveiling the force into which initiation is warranted and even required. The pair finally communes to find a higher world in harmonischem Anschauen, translated here as in harmonic contemplation, but more aptly a harmonic intuition. Intuition, or Anschauung, was a key terminus technicus for Goethe. In a remarkably brief, humorous engagement with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant called Judgment Through Intuitive Perception, Goethe remarks that Kant had, quote, a roguishly ironic way of working, insofar as Kant set limits to our ability to know, while simultaneously, with a casual gesture, as Goethe puts it, pointing beyond those limits in their very demarcation. This is not the place to referee Goethe's contraception, which has been subject to much interpretation, but to recall one passage highly relevant for understanding the end of Goethe's poem, with its leap beyond the vegetal realm to encompass the animal and even human. What warrants or justifies this leap beyond poetic fancy? Goethe writes, why should it not also hold true in the intellectual arena that through an intuitive perception, Anschauen, of eternally creative nature, we may become worthy of participating spiritually, intellectually, in its creative processes? One might also translate the spiritual participation of the knower in the known, of the observer within observed nature, as a mental participation. The word geistig in German carries, of course, both meanings. The harmonic intuition that binds lover and beloved, teacher and pupil, riddler and initiate into a commonly binding wisdom is also an initiation into the mystical truth of their amorous union as one that partakes in nature's creatio continua, its perpetual act of generativity in the now of vegetal profusion. Kant's third critique was published in 1790, the exact same year Goethe published his essay on the Metamorphosis of Plants, and we know from Goethe's morphological writings that the third critique was the work of Kant's that Goethe most closely studied. Though in this essay on intuitive judgment, Goethe claims to be capable of what Kant cordoned off from human possibility, namely intuitive judgments, I'd like to suggest that Goethe's actual morphological essays, beyond the essay on the Metamorphosis of Plants, elaborate on an earlier section of Kant's third critique, namely section 65, where Kant distinguishes between mechanism and organism in a manner that recalls moments in De Anima when Aristotle, for example, calls on the reader to imagine a living axe in order to begin to conceive of the kind of hylomorphic or form-matter unity possessed by the animal. To signal where I'm going with this, I'd like to suggest that Goethe offers us an alternative to Kant, not only in developing a method of the intuitive understanding he thought impossible for us as finite rational beings, but also in moving toward a curious recuperation of natural teleology that simultaneously unmoors the telos of the organism and casts it adrift, as it were. Kant, in very broad, crude strokes, can be thought of as deontologizing and subjectivizing natural teleology. It becomes for him a structure, in a sense, necessitated by the innate makeup of our mental architecture when we attempt to understand living organisms. Section 65 of Kant's critique can be read as a meditation on the distinction between efficient and formal final causalities. We are most familiar nowadays with the former, which Kant envisioned as a descending series of causes and effects, the things that are the effects and that hence presuppose those before them as their causes cannot in turn be causes of these precedent others. This is a chain of linear, unidirectional cause and effect that Kant terms nexus effectivus. Kant envisions, however, you might think of billiard balls bouncing against each other. Kant envisions, however, a kind of causal connection in terms of a concept of reason, namely the concept of a purpose. Considered again as a series, the dependence of effect on cause would be bidirectional, ascending as well as descending our ladder or chain of causes and effects. In other words, each part, say of an organism or a house, could simultaneously be cause and effect of other parts and itself in a deep reciprocity. This kind of causality Kant terms nexus finalis. Importantly, this latter teleological causality is evinced by artifacts as well as organisms, extrinsically in the former, intrinsically in the latter. Take a watch, or more simply a house, as an example. The possibility and form of the parts that make up the house depend on the concept of the house, the architectonic design or blueprint of the whole that grants the parts unity, functional purpose, arrangement. But the concept of the house precedes the actually built house. That concept of the house's unity lies in the mind of the architect or builder, the artificer, and not within the artifact itself. An organism, unlike a watch or a house, immanently exhibits its own concept of purposive unity. Kant does not posit an intelligent designer whose mind could contain the concepts or blueprints for all organism species, nor does he believe some occult vitalist force within the organism magically steers it to the state of an organized whole. As he puts it, in such a product of nature, just as each part exists only as a result of all the rest, so we also think of each part as existing for the sake of the others and on account of the whole, i.e. as an organ, the eye and the heart, say. But that is not enough, for the part could also be an instrument of artifice, in which case we would be presenting its possibility as depending on an extrinsic purpose, the button and the battery, say. Rather, we must think of each part as an organ that produces the other parts, so that each reciprocally produces the other. Something like this cannot be an instrument of art, by which he means artifice, but can be an instrument only of nature. And if a product meets that second condition as well, and only because of this, will it be both an organized and a self-organizing being, which therefore can be a natural purpose. Absolutely crucial here is the new word Kant introduces, namely self-organization. This is a concept that Goethe will directly draw on in his morphological writings when thinking through the organism in terms of parts and wholes. For now, however, let's remain with Kant's example. The watch exhibits a merely external purposiveness, its parts coherent to a whole because of the watchmaker's concept of the purpose of that whole, timekeeping. The watch is organized, indeed, but not by itself, rather by the watchmaker's idea. An organism, on the other hand, exhibits an internal purposiveness. The whole does not simply precede and make sense of the parts, but the parts reciprocally depend on each other and the whole, each of which is cause and effect of the other. Kant even says that the parts produce each other reciprocally and thus generate the very whole that conditions them and makes sense of their individual form and function. The whole is an achievement here rather than a given. The organism is organized like a watch, but the organism is also self-organizing. For, seen teleologically, its unifying concept of purpose, what the whole that it is for, qua whole, comes not from without, from God, say, but from within. This idea of the organism's telic self-organization forced Kant to seek an analogy, an analog to the nexus finalis of natural purposes. He first turns to the analog of human art, the watch, the house, even the artwork, then to the notion of life itself. As Kant puts this, we say far too little if we call this an analog of art, for in that case we think of an artist, a rational being apart from nature. Rather, nature organizes itself, and it does so within each species of its organized products. We might be closer if we called this inscrutable property of nature an analog of life. In a sense, Kant is trying to think through the technique, the artistry of living nature. But Kant also does not want to posit a mysterious living force, as in Blumenbach's formative drive, and so supplement mechanistic, efficiently causal, material nature with some alien, non-mechanistic principle conjoined to it. That would be the other side of the divine pitfall, or the theic pitfall, call it the vitalist pitfall. Kant instead dwells at the epistemic impasse. As he puts it, strictly speaking, therefore, the organization of nature has nothing analogous to any causality known to us. We subjectively bring the teleology to it, as it were, because of our own cognitive limitations. This is one of the few sentences in the third critique where Kant feels compelled to add a rare footnote. Dissatisfied, he turns in this curious footnote to society and the political. On the other hand, the analogy of these direct natural purposes can serve to elucidate a certain kind of association among people, though one found more often as an idea than in actuality. In speaking of the complete transformation of a large people into a state, which took place recently, Kant likely refers to the American Revolution, the word organization was frequently and very aptly applied to the establishment of legal authorities and even to the entire body politic. For each member in such a whole should indeed be not merely a means, but also a purpose. While each member contributes to making the whole possible, the idea of that whole should in turn determine the member's position and function. Consultation with digital sources shows that just around 1800, the word organization, in German Organisation, begins exponentially rising in lexical usage in the German language, and the term's provenance in a socio-political context will prove decisive for Goethe's Morphology of Plants in later writings after the essay on their metamorphosis. Important here, however, is the fact that one and the same term, organization, articulates what we might call a mereological problematic, a reciprocal conditioning and generating of parts and parts and parts and whole. Each means an end of the other simultaneously. Strikingly, that mereological problematic extends in Kant's usage of the term from the realm of human artifice to that of natural life, and even in the footnote to society. I'd like to suggest that Goethe's first step in implementing his method of intuitive understanding of organisms in observational practice involves what might be called a partial re-ontologization of natural teleology in terms of the organism's organization, and that contra Kant. That the term crosses the domains of human art, nature, and society in section 65 of Kant's third critique is no coincidence. Indeed, in a text titled Fate of the Manuscript from 1817, reflecting back on his essay tracking plant metamorphosis, Goethe notes that upon returning to Germany from his Italian sojourn, he in fact wrote 3 essays that point toward a common morphological method of observation, each text attuned to a different ontological district. The very same 3 domains Kant thought of as insufficient analogs for the organism's self-organization. In the realm of natural life, his essay Attempt to Explain the Metamorphosis of Plants, 1790. In the realm of art, Simple Imitation of Nature, Manner, and Style, 1789. And in the realm of society, The Roman Carnival, 1788. With regard to this simultaneously emergent triad of texts, Goethe relates, "They all show what was going on inside me at that time, and what position I had taken against those three great regions of the world. Such remarks point not only to the transdisciplinary reach of Goethe's morphological method, but also to its versatility. Given, as he put it, that the theory of form, Gestalt, is that of transformation, the method allowing one to observe form as transformation itself transforms to fit novel, unique realms of application. Rather than eliding the borders distinguishing the ontological world regions of nature, art, and society, Goethe's morphology, as a mobile ensemble of observational practices and orienting principles, would enable an observer to draw lines of demarcation between them while still dwelling in their intellectually generative interstices. Goethe's morphology, then, is itself a kind of protean meta-method, perhaps explaining why there is no consensus in recent scholarship as to whether his morphological writings coalesce into something that can justifiably be termed a coherent method in the first place. The question of morphology's putative methodological consistency might seem to depend on how influential one takes the background philosophical commitments animating Goethe's natural science to be. Goethe himself, however, directly professes to possess a unique method in contradistinction to philosophy. Since Schiller's passing, he wrote, I had quietly distanced myself from all philosophy and only sought to train my innate methodology, eine mir angeborene Methodik, by turning it against nature, art, and life. Again, those three, to ever greater certainty and agility. In a text titled Contemplation on Morphology as Such from 1798, Goethe describes morphology as a kind of second-order discipline that feeds off of what might seem marginal, even accidental, to all other disciplines in order to zero in on its unique object of study. It, morphology, must first legitimize itself as a special science by making what is occasionally and accidentally dealt with by others its main subject, by collecting what is scattered there, and by establishing a new standpoint from which natural things can be contemplated with ease and comfort. End quote. Key here is the connection drawn between a new science, Wissenschaft, in the modern sense, and the ancient notion of Theoria, of the contemplation or Betrachtung of an eternal cosmos that may be noetically apprehended from a human vantage point with ease and comfort. Anything but a given, such a contemplative human standpoint must in modernity be both rediscovered and constructed within the metamorphic chaos of a temporalized nature and a complex field of increasingly insular specialized disciplines. Given this disciplinary fragmentation of knowledge, morphology must necessarily inhabit the interstices between disciplines, and for this reason Goethe can claim that morphology is not in conflict with any doctrine, that it does not need to clear anything away to make room for itself. Morphology rather collects that which lies at disciplinary borders and peripheries so as to preserve thereby a contemplative vantage point in accord with the human intellect. Goethe hence concludes that the operations of the mind by which morphology composes the phenomenon are, quote, appropriate and pleasant to human nature, angemessen und angenehm. In the same fragment, he goes so far to say that morphology only wants to represent, not to explain. How exactly, though, does he address the mereological problematic, the problem of parts and wholes generating, conditioning one another that Kant addresses in that section 65? In his essay on the laws of organization as such from the morphological notebooks, Goethe distinguishes between inorganic and organic realms via recourse to an account of how minerals come into and pass out of beings. Not just a geological treatise, however, the essay moves from mineral to vegetal, from vegetal to animal realms of nature. In this regard, one might read it as Goethe's own far zanier rewriting of Aristotle's De Anima. Throughout the treatise, empirical structural genesis is conceptually primary to static mereological or part-whole configurations. Such empirical genesis or metamorphosis is, however, steered by a kind of ideal genetic structure. In the case of minerals, their crystallization and decomposition does indeed occur according to laws, but crystals cannot be said to properly grow. Rather, they aggregate in a way that knows neither border nor order. When part of a mineral is cut off from the aggregate whole in which it is ingredient, then the body, which at first seemed destroyed, lies before us again in its perfection, Goethe writes. A mineral aggregate has no borders, thus no proper environment of its own. Without definitive beginning or end, minerals do not know death. A severed part of a crystal does indeed cease to be a part of that mineral aggregate, but it does not thereby cease to exist as crystal as such. It merely becomes a new whole. In contrast, were one to sever a part from an artifactual whole, then the part would cease to exist qua part. A hammer handle, broken off from its iron head, is not the handle of a hammer anymore, but just a piece of elongated wood. Its identity, qua part, is tied to how it occupies a functional role within the whole tool. You might also think, if recalling Aristotle, that a wooden plank gains the form of the threshold of a house if it's placed by the builder where the door should go, but the same wooden plank can just as well serve the functional role of a roof beam, in which case it becomes a different kind of part. As Goethe puts this, the main characteristic of the mineral bodies is the indifference of their parts with regard to their being together, their co- and subordination. Furthermore, such inorganic states cannot be sequentially ordered into a directed processual logic, but are instead essentially reversible. Minerals appear to wait for a recomposition into a former state. Even if they evince a kind of inclination, inorganic formations ultimately depend only on external or extrinsic determinations. Despite this, Goethe does not deny minerals, quote, the tender share that is due to them in the general breath of life in nature, end quote. Beginning with a discussion of mineral mereology is thus significant for Goethe's morphological project, for it brings into view the remarkably expansive scope that the concept of organization had for Goethe. Even stones, in some idiosyncratic sense, participate in the phenomenon of life qua self-organization. Despite this, however, minerals are not alive in any straightforward biological sense. In an essay titled Natural Doctrine, published in Wieland's Deutscher Merkur, shortly after his return from Italy, Goethe argued vehemently against a friend's remark, writing back home from a German winter, that the ice crystal formations on a windowsill grow in a vegetal manner. Goethe adamantly refuses this move, not, however, by adhering to a vertical hierarchical scala naturae model, a chain of being, but by collapsing that hierarchy into a horizontal series of equal peaks or ontological orders of nature. The spirit, he writes, sees well that he has to subordinate all together to one single concept, the concept of life in the broadest sense. He will never try to bring the three great peaks, crystallization, vegetation, and animal organization, closer to each other. Rather, he will only try to know their interstices, Zwischenräume, between spaces, exactly, and dwell with great interest on the points where the different realms seem to meet and merge into each other. A salt is not a tree not an animal. Here we can set the stakes. Rather than severing ontological districts of nature off from one another in a vertical hierarchy a classical chain of being, morphological observation always remains careful to dwell at the liminal spaces between them, seeing how the concept of life in its broadest sense manifests itself at those blurry thresholds between logically distinct forms of part-whole organization. While Kant's footnote on social organization as an analog to the self-organization of life was posed as a mere analogy, Goethe takes it a step farther when addressing the kind of whole that is the plant. Unlike minerals, plants present an interestingly liminal case, situated as they are on the threshold between the inorganic and the organic, some plants occupying one of what Goethe termed the liminal spaces. In his copy of Kant's Third Critique, Goethe tellingly wrote the marginal note, indifference or Gleichgültigkeit of the plant kingdom, beside Kant's consideration of a vegetal being in section 64. The section addresses three ways in which a tree is a natural purpose unto itself. First, insofar as it reproduces its genus, giving rise to other trees. Second, insofar as it generates itself as an individual, i.e. grows. And third, most interestingly, insofar as certain of its parts may in turn come to take on the status of independent wholes, say through grafting. The potential independence of a vegetal part from the whole in which it is embedded led Goethe to consider then a contact point of mereological indifference between the living and the non-living, allowing plants to appear somewhat mineral-like in certain cases, just as our poem allowed the human being to appear somewhat plant-like. In Laws of Organization, Goethe speaks of plants as progressive modifications of the same organ, the subsequently diversified parts of which, however, may form as apparent wholes. For plants separated and torn into many parts will again sprout from the earth as just so many apparent wholes. At the same time, and unlike minerals, plants obey a directed processual logic of six-stage development. Goethe associates this processual logic with the plant's entelechy in a passage worth quoting in full, for it draws on a socio-political metaphorics key for understanding not just the structural relation between parts and whole, but how such relations are processually maintained and even transformed, if not compromised. In other words, where Kant claims that the parts must reciprocally cause and even produce each other and the whole in turn, Goethe actually observes and imagines how this might take place, and he does so by mining, as it were, the analog of the social indexed in Kant's footnote. Tracking how the plant actively maintains its wholeness as it grows allows one to trace a kind of vegetal politics on view throughout the morphological notebooks. This passage in particular exemplifies the conceptual movement. Each leaf, each eye in itself has the right to be a tree. They do not reach to it, for the ruling health of the stem, the trunk, restrains them. One does not repeat often enough that every organization unites various living things. In the present case, let us look at the stem, which is usually round, or can be considered round from the inside. It is precisely this roundness that holds the individualities of the leaves and the eyes together as a unity, and lets them, in orderly succession, rise to regular development up to the flower and fruit. If such a plant entelechy is inhibited, if not suspended, then the center loses its legislative power, gesetzgebende Gewalt. The periphery crowds together, and each individual striving now exercises its particular right, the right to become a whole. The plant's entelechy, its being in realization of its inner telos, governs its development in a healthy case, when not inhibited, such that at every moment of its processual self-unfolding, the plant is always already fulfilling its imminent end. When Goethe himself defines entelechy, he emphasizes the Aristotelian sense of active, ever-renewed fulfillment. As he elsewhere defined it, the Greeks called entelecheia a being that is always in function. Function, rightly understood, is existence conceived in activity. What the plant truly is, that in which its existence genuinely consists, is not its current formation at any given point in empirical time, but its ongoing vital activity, its functioning so as to realize its own end and therefore become more fully what it should be. Already a tricky normative dimension is at play here in Goethe's reference to the ruling health that keeps individual parts bound within a whole, rather than splintering off to form new wholes, in this case trees. The context here is a discussion of anomalous vegetal growths, cases that lead Goethe to contemplate how such anomalies point to multiplicity in unity. This multiplicity in unity, or plurality in unity, a sort of vegetal e pluribus unum, is governed by the legislative power of the middle, the round stem, functioning as an organizing center that regulates the growth of individual parts in regular development. Should this legislative power, as Goethe terms it, become dysfunctional or unhealthy, a decentering ensues. Particular components, the individualities, each described as a striving agent, exercise their right to constitute a new whole, resulting in the self-dispersal of the whole into peripherally striving parts that seek to individuate themselves at the expense of unity. Goethe does not, however, disparage this unruly self-dispersion of the vegetal whole, but recognizes each part's rights, continuing to note, this time with regard to leaf division, when leaves divide, or rather when they develop from themselves into multifariousness, this is a striving to become more perfect, in the sense that every leaf wants to become a branch, just as every branch wants to become a tree. All classes, orders, and families have the right to strive for this. If parts each have a right to develop into wholes, then these individuals striving themselves partake in a more universal striving to gain in perfection through self-differentiation. Vegetal entelechy thus does not seek to realize some predetermined empirical end state, which would all too rigidly comprehend the telos, but rather strives to form a more perfect union, establish a more internally variegated configuration, a maximally realized, internally differentiated whole. Such entelechy does not just aim for blossom then, but for an inwardly tensed form of unity characterized by self-multiplying vital exuberance. The plant must, as it were, strike a balance between self-diversification into a more internally complex being and overreaching in such striving so as to disperse into a collection of independent, apparent wholes. In his poem, the plant avoids this pitfall, but it is, of course, a poem. Thank you.